To understand why Turkey could become Israel's next big confrontation in the Middle East, you need to go back in time and understand what has been lost. In the 1990s, Israel and Turkey were strategic allies of the First Order. Their armies exercised jointly, their pilots trained together in the skies over the Mediterranean, and intelligence cooperation was profound. It was one of the strongest alliances Israel had ever had with a Muslim-majority country. This passive cooperation makes the present even more dangerous, because when allies become enemies, they carry with them decades of mutual knowledge, and that knowledge can be used as a weapon. Since Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power, Turkish national pride has not only grown, but gained two additional dimensions: the Turkish president's megalomaniacal personality and his rigid Islamic outlook. The Jerusalem Post Erdogan is not just a political leader. He is the architect of a new Turkish identity that mixes Ataturk's nationalism with nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire and a religious agenda that resonates deeply in the streets of Ankara and Istanbul. And it is precisely this explosive combination that puts Turkey on a collision course with Israel in an increasingly concrete way. The most recent trigger came in October 2025 when the Israeli Navy intercepted the Sumud flotilla, which was trying to reach Gaza carrying activists from various parts of the world, including climate activist Greta Thunberg. A Turkish court has decided to indict Netanyahu and 35 other Israeli officials, including Defense Minister Israel Katz and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, for their role in the October 2025 naval intercept of the Gaza flotilla, with Istanbul's chief prosecutor accusing those indicted of having participated in a military operation against civilians in international waters. Yahoo! The Israeli response was immediate and angry. Officials called Erdogan a paper tiger, and an Israeli minister even proposed a complete severing of diplomatic relations with Ankara. But it was what Erdogan said on April 12, 2026, in front of an audience at the International Asia Political Parties Conference in Istanbul, that turned the words into something that seems less and less rhetoric and more doctrine. Erdogan said Turkey could take military action against Israel if necessary, comparing that possibility to past Turkish interventions in Karabakh and Libya, stating, "Just as we entered Karabakh, just as we entered Libya, we will do the same to them. There is nothing stopping us. We just need to be strong so that we can take these steps." The Jerusalem Post. It is essential to understand the historical weight of these words. Turkey did not enter Karabakh or Libya with conventional armies in open battles. He entered with drones, with military advisors, with weapons, with intelligence, and with enough political force to turn the course of conflicts that seemed decided. The Bayraktar TB2, a Turkish drone that became a symbol of Ankara's military power, was decisive in Libya and Azerbaijan. Turkey has a formidable military, the second largest in NATO, with advanced drones like the Bayraktar TB2 that have proven effective in conflicts from Libya to Ukraine. Feed, when Erdogan says he will do to Israel what he did to these countries, he is signaling a strategy, not just venting. To understand why Israel should take this threat seriously, one needs to look at what Turkey has built in Syria after the fall of Bashar Assad in late 2024. The fall of the Assad regime, along with the declining status of Syria's key allies Russia and Iran, has allowed Turkey to significantly increase its influence in the war-torn country, with the aim of turning Syria into a Turkish protectorate. The Times of Israel Ankara was one of the first countries to reopen its embassy in Damascus, and the new Syrian leader, Ahmed al-Shara, has visited Erdogan several times. Turkey has begun training Syrian forces and signaled its willingness to establish military bases on Syrian territory. This represents a geographic and strategic problem of the First Order for Israel. Syria borders Israel in the north. If Turkey effectively transforms Syria into a zone of military influence, Israel will have a hostile and militarily capable regional power less than 100 kilometers from its most populous cities. The Nagel Committee, which presented its recommendations in January 2025, warned that a new threat will be created if the Syrian force becomes, in practice, a Turkish proxy, as part of the implementation of Turkey's dream of restoring its former crown and glory, and called this threat drastic among countries with which Israel has some kind of peace agreement. The Times of Israel. Since Assad's removal, Israel has carried out numerous air and ground operations in Syrian territory, degrading heavy military equipment and attacking command and logistics infrastructure. Israel has also expanded its occupation of the Golan Heights and seeks to prevent the re-establishment of any significant Syrian military presence south of Damascus, on the approaches to the Golan. Arab Center DC, these actions directly collide with the Turkish project to build and professionalize the armed forces of the new Syria. In September 2025, Ankara began training Syrian forces and signaled that it is ready to provide air defense support and even established military bases in the country. Two antagonistic projects, the Israeli and the Turkish, are competing for the same territory, with neither of them willing to back down. The deterioration in relations was also intensified by the Israeli attack on the Hamas delegation in Qatar in September 2025, Turkey's closest regional ally and formally designated as a major non-NATO ally of the United States. Arab Center DC. This episode was a sign that Israel was willing to attack targets linked to Türkiye, even when it meant hitting the territory of an American ally. For Erdogan, this was a humiliation that could not be ignored. The economic issue also fuels this confrontation in ways that are often underestimated. Turkey completely suspended trade with Israel in May 2025, closed its airspace to Israeli flights in August, and banned Israeli ships from docking in Turkish ports, measures that analysts described as a wartime-level disruption. And that set aside billions in bilateral trade that was previously worth $7 billion a year. JFeed for Israel, this cut was painful. For Turkey, it was a political gesture with real economic costs at a time when the Turkish economy was already fragile. The fact that Erdogan accepted this cost says a lot about the degree of political commitment to this position. Now, the question that really matters, would Israel attack Turkey? And if so, how and why? The straightforward answer is that a conventional Israeli attack on Turkish territory is unlikely in the short term. But Israeli security logic creates conditions for escalations that could come very close. Israel has a well-established military doctrine: eliminate threats before they take hold. This is what it did with the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, the Syrian one in 2007, the Hezbollah arsenals for years, and most recently, Iranian targets in 2025. If Turkey starts using Syria to transfer weapons or install military infrastructure that Israel considers an existential threat, the Israeli response could come before the world realizes that the conflict has already begun. Earlier this year, Turkey and Israel established a de-escalation mechanism aimed at preventing conflict between their troops in Syria. The move came after Syria's foreign ministry said Israeli fighter jets had attacked a Syrian airbase that Turkey hoped to use. The Times of Israel, this episode, reveals that both are already operating in the same theater of operations, with margins for error that decrease every week. A pilot in the wrong place, a missile fired by the wrong actor, a misinterpretation of a troop movement, and the de-escalation mechanism could turn to ash before any diplomat can pick up the phone. Three developments encourage Erdogan. First, Israel's international isolation following the war in Gaza. Second, Turkish success in bringing about a turnaround in Syria has ensured Turkish loyalty from Syrian leader Ahmed al-Sharaa, who depends on Turkish military assistance to strengthen his government. Third, the personal connection and good relations between Erdogan and US President Trump, who has publicly declared that he loves him. And this is where we get to the heart of the American problem. The United States is trapped in a contradiction that is almost impossible to resolve. On the one hand, Israel is Washington's closest ally in the Middle East, with historical, strategic, cultural, and political ties that go far beyond any formal agreement. On the other, Turkey has been a member of NATO since 1952 and is home to the Incirlik Air Base, which is crucial to American military operations in the Middle East. If Israel and Turkey enter into open conflict, Washington will not be able to stand by, and any choice you make will cost you dearly. Incirlik Air Base, located in southern Turkey, is one of the most important United States military installations in the world. From there, reconnaissance missions, support operations, and all the logistics that support the American presence in the region come from there. Turkey has already threatened, in past moments of tension, to close this base to the Americans. If Ankara decides to use this card during a confrontation with Israel, Washington would find itself in a very serious operational situation. Either it puts pressure on Israel to retreat, or it risks losing access to a base that is the heart of its power projection in the Middle East. Furthermore, Turkey is one of the largest armies in NATO. Any conflict in which Turkey is involved automatically triggers talks on Article 5 of the alliance, which provides for collective defense. Of course, Israel is not a member of NATO, and an Israeli attack on Turkey would not automatically trigger Article 5. But the opposite is also true. If Turkey attacks Israel, the United States would be in a position where a NATO ally is at war with its closest ally in the Middle East. No diplomatic manual was written for this scenario. Turkey has numerical depth and regional reach, while Israel has technological superiority, intelligence capabilities, and combat experience in high-intensity scenarios. Any direct conflict would likely be extremely costly for both sides and could quickly escalate across the region, attracting outside powers and destabilizing the Middle East. This balance of asymmetric terror is precisely what makes the scenario so unpredictable. Neither side can win cleanly, but both have incentives to prove to the other that they will not back down. For the United States, the worst-case scenario is not even a war between Israel and Turkey per se. It is the fragmentation of NATO that this conflict could cause. The Atlantic Alliance is already experiencing enormous tensions, with disputes over the defense budget, the stance towards Russia, and the role of the United States in the world. An Israel-Turkey confrontation would force each NATO member to choose a side or abstain, in which case abstention would be almost as destructive as the wrong choice. There is also the energy dimension that many analysts underestimate. The Eastern Mediterranean is at the center of a dispute over natural gas reserves involving Israel, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. Israel discovered gigantic reserves in the Leviathan and Tamar fields and is interested in exporting this gas to Europe, preferably via Greece and Cyprus. Turkey, which also disputes part of these waters, sees this project as a threat to its economic and strategic interests. A military conflict between the two countries could paralyze these energy projects and deprive Europe of an alternative to Russian gas at a time when that alternative is needed more than ever. Even as the rhetoric intensifies, structural limits make a large-scale confrontation unlikely. Turkey's position differs from Iran's. Unlike Tehran, Ankara is anchored in the Western system as a member of NATO and does not adopt an openly hostile stance in military terms. Their opposition has remained mainly rhetorical, but rhetoric that is repeated, that is institutionalized in arrest warrants, trade embargoes, and troop movements can, over time, create its own logic. Leaders who build political identity through confrontation with external enemies rarely manage to back down without paying an internal political price. What makes this scenario different from other moments of tension in the Middle East is the speed with which things changed. Less than 2 years ago, Israel and Turkey still had functioning diplomatic relations, bilateral trade worth $7 billion a year, and open communication channels. Today, there are international arrest warrants, total trade embargoes, troops from both countries operating in the same Syrian territory, and a Turkish president comparing a possible intervention against Israel to military campaigns he has already carried out. The rate of deterioration is alarming. What the next few months will tell the world is whether this confrontation will crystallize into something irreversible, or whether the strategic rationality of both sides will prevail. For now, the conflict is most likely to remain in the gray zone. Israeli airstrikes in Syria that affect Turkish interests, mutual diplomatic pressure, influence operations, and the buildup of forces that neither side officially calls preparation for war. But gray areas have a dangerous property: they don't stay gray forever.